My name's Adela, and I make minis. As you may have gathered, I am a big fan of pots, but what you might not know is that I'm also a little bit of a gamer. One of my favourites has got to be Elden, even though I am absolutely useless at it. A couple of weeks ago, Shadow of the Erdtree dropped, which is the game's one and only expansion. So I thought this would be a great time to revisit the lands between and maybe do a little bit of a project. My plan is to make my own little mini version of one of the best characters there is. That's right, I'm talking about the one and only Iron Fist Alexander, and if you don't know who he is, you'll quickly know why I've picked him. So the first stage is to do a little bit of research. We're going to jump into the game and have a look at him and see what we might need to do to make him. Okay, so I'm in Redmane Castle and I'm going to go see Alexander and see how he's made and see how I might make my own. There he is. Alright, he's much bigger than I thought he'd be. His little chicken legs. Okay, so when there's stuff like this, I like to break it down into components because it gives you a much more manageable idea of like, how are you going to make this? Because if you look at it as one, then it's just going to get overwhelming. So for this one, I'm going to start with the body, and the body's probably been thrown, but we're going to pinch ours. Oh, hang on, let's see if we can go up. Maybe not. So he's got a nice tapered bottom and then a big pot belly, so the widest point is the middle, so that will probably be where the bottom half ends and the top half starts. The top, he's got a nice chunky lip, which is good because that won't chip as easily, and then you've got this gorgeous detail all the way around, which I'm not really sure how I'm going to do. So you've got the Celtic knot, and then there's these wave-like details. I think the Celtic knot, I might try and do some tiny little sausages and almost just stick those on. And then those waves, that could be something that we could trim in. So once the clay's hardened a little bit, we trim that in. Or we can try and fudge it with a wire brush and actually just brush those layers on. And then he does have some handles. They look like they might be more like the start of a chain, which you do see in quite a few of the older style jars, because I think he is essentially a jar, because he does have a little stopper or like a cork at the top. Oh, he's cute. Okay, I'm excited to do this now. I started things off by pinching out the bottom half into a wide funnel. It was a little bit uneven, but luckily the top half had a similar amount of wonk that meant the overall shape was pretty even when I joined them together. I'm generally not too precious at this stage because I know that the real shaping comes next. I like to use my metal rib to smooth out the join. Here, I'm not only removing excess material, but I'm also compressing the clay and reinforcing that join. I then moved on to the neck, which in this case is more of an opening than anything else. Because it's so short and wide, I decided to open up the body and pinch a lip straight from there. Once that was done, I removed the taper at the end of the lip and squared it off to make it a little bit chunkier. At this stage, the clay has firmed up a little, making it a good time to go back and refine the body. I usually use this wooden tool to pat the clay into the right shape. Once I was happy, it was time to move on to the decoration. I decided to tackle the little ridges that define the two embellished sections first. I made these by rolling out super small sausages of clay and then blending them into the body. By doing it this way, I'm able to create thinner ridges without rolling out thinner sausages, which I would soon learn is a total nightmare. Blending them in like this also means they're less likely to fall off further down the line, so it's a win-win. Next, I decided to tackle the little braid that runs round his middle. Up until now, I don't think I really appreciated how small some of the details on this pot were going to have to be. I usually make much smaller vases with much less intricate decoration, and I thought, oh, I've scaled up quite a lot for this one. Turns out, I did not. My first idea was to try and copy the braid literally. I made 2 super thin sausages, even thinner than the ridges, and started to intertwine them. I quickly learned that clay this thin dries out at light speed. It would lose elasticity after a short time and crack whenever I tried to braid with it. I also wasn't able to make a very tight braid on my first attempt, and it ended up being way too big for the pot. Not giving up, I had the idea to use my needle tool as a guide for the little loops. It helped massively as it gave the clay something to bend around and the braid became a lot tighter and a lot smaller. But, because the bends were sharper, it meant I had even less time to work with the clay. I attempted to keep the clay moist with my paintbrush, but I wasn't very successful. When it doesn't want to work, it doesn't want to work. It was back to the drawing board for me. I briefly considered making a sprig mould, but I worried that the clay would be too thin and way too fragile and would dry out even faster. You'll have seen a lot of sprig moulds if you've ever clapped eyes on a Wedgwood vase. They're the little 3-dimensional white bits that are formed in super shallow moulds. Having shelved that idea, I then experimented with cutting out the negative space on a strip of clay to mimic the braid. Think of it more like carving it out, but it just didn't look convincing enough. Having hit a brick wall a few too many times with this, I decided to leave this problem to marinate for a little bit and move on to the upper half of the body. I began by sketching out the waves with my pencil just to give me a rough idea of where everything was going. After some time studying the source images for these sketches, I realised that this was more of a relief carving than I'd originally thought. I think I'd interpreted it as more of a ridged texture than defined lines. It became obvious then that I was going to have to carve away some of the clay to make this work. I used my loop tool for a little bit, but it was way too big, so I ended up mainly using my pencil to gouge out the clay, but even that was too thick in some areas. I then used a wet brush to soften the edges and neaten everything up. I've never done this kind of decoration before, so it was definitely a learning experience for me. It took me quite a bit of time, but I think it ended up looking pretty good. I moved on to the handles next. Definitely not because I was avoiding the braid. The handles on this little guy are just some simple hoops. Looking at him in the game, it looks like he's got little lug handles that he's just stuck his arms through. Finally, the time had come to face the braid again. Whilst I was carving, I'd had the idea to make a twist rather than a braid. It still has the same visual feeling, but the clay doesn't need to be handled quite as much or to bend at such a sharp angle. And you know what? I think I may have finally nailed it. Overall, I think he ended up a very cute little jar. Okay, it's not totally accurate, but maybe he could be your cousin? Jasper Soft Hands? I don't know. Maybe you've got some better ideas in the comments. Alright, so that is the first stage done, and now we've just got to let him dry out really slowly, otherwise he might start cracking. And then he's off to the kiln and ready to be glazed. So make sure you stick around for that. See you soon.